AM560theanswer.com. Now, from the Signature Bank Studios, this is Chicago's Morning Answer with Dan Proft on AM560. The Answer.
Top of the morning, Dan Proft here. Yesterday, I guess it was Wednesday, oral arguments before the Supreme Court on the birthright citizenship case, the executive order that Trump penned. There was this exchange between Solicitor General John Sauer and Chief Justice John Roberts about the practical impacts of birthright citizenship, like birth tourism. An example of what Sauer was referring to, reported recently by a network affiliate in L.A., these maternity hotels.
Federal agents swooping in this morning to raid what they are calling maternity tourism rings. The ring helps pregnant women, most of them in this area from China, illegally travel to the U.S. to give birth to American babies. NBC4's Hetty Chang has more from Orange County.
Just after sunrise, they are ready to roll. Our cameras are there as dozens of federal investigators storm into the Carlisle apartments in Irvine.
If you come here in the evening, you see all the pregnant women walking around.
Investigators say this building and at least 20 other locations they raided in L.A., Orange, and San Bernardino counties double as maternity hotels.
People who come from China to the United States for the sole purpose
of having a kid. This was the exchange on that topic between Sauer and Roberts.
Based on Chinese media reports, there are 500 birth tourism companies in the People's Republic of China whose business is to bring people here to give birth and return to that nation.
Having said all that, you do agree that that has no impact on the legal analysis before us?
I think it's, I'd quote what Justice Scalia said in his Hamdan dissent, where their interpretation has these implications that could not possibly have been approved by the 19th century framers of this amendment. I think that shows that they've made a mess. Their interpretation has made a mess of the provision.
Well, it certainly wasn't a problem in the 19th century.
No, but of course, we're in a new world now, as Justice Alito pointed out, where 8 billion people are one plane ride away from having a child who's a U.S. citizen.
Well, it's a new world. It's the same Constitution.
It is, and as Justice Scalia said, I think in the case that Justice Alito was referring to, you've got a constitutional provision that addresses certain evils, and it should be extended to reasonably comparable evils. He said that about statutory interpretation. I think the same principle applies here, and I think we quote that in our brief.
Yeah, and that exchange, Sauer did a nice job, which is why I like him for Attorney General, frankly. Sharp legal mind. We got a new world, but it's the same old Constitution, right? So apply the fundamental principles and legislative intent, the black letter of the 14th Amendment to this new world. That's what Sauer is arguing. And you have to look at the implications of bastardizing the meaning of the Constitution and, frankly, federal statutory law, including, as we discussed yesterday with Professor Epstein, the statutes regarding naturalization. For more on this and other matters, please be joined by Joseph Moreno, former federal prosecutor with the Department of Justice in the National Security Division, former staff member with the FBI's 9/11 Review Commission, and a U.S. Army combat veteran. Joseph Moreno, thanks for joining us again. Appreciate it.
Dan, good morning. Good to be with you.
Good to have you. And so, give us your perspective on, the arguments that were bandied about on Wednesday, and specifically, if you want to comment on this. I thought about you in this because the maternity tourism also has national security implications, and that was, that's your bailiwick in part. So your thoughts on this larger discussion about birthright citizenship?
Sure. Well, Dan, I think the exchange that you just played will go to the heart of what the 6 conservatives on the court will grapple with. I mean, let's face it, the 3 progressives, we know where they're going to come out, right? They're policy driven. They will get to whatever policy they favor. So it's really
sorry to interrupt, but KBJ thinks if her wallet is stolen in Japan, she's a citizen of Japan because when they return it. I mean, so yeah, I get it.
Yeah. I mean, so conservatives, we're not supposed to figure out the policy we favor and then find a way to back into it. We're supposed to read the law, the amendment, the executive order, and go to the language and our best interpretation of the intent that was made at the time. And so that's what the conservatives will grapple with, because they're going to say this could be a terrible policy of letting anyone who is born there, whether they've jumped the wall, whether they've flown in for the sole purpose of having a child, but they could say that's terrible, but it's not the court's job to fix. That's Congress's job. So they're going to have to kind of really fight with their urge to fix this mess with their best interpretation of the amendment. Now, that's not to say we know how they're going to come out on this. They might look at this and say, there's no way back in 1868 this was intended to allow for absolutely unlimited birthright citizenship. There's a very strong argument that this amendment was specifically designed to overrule the Dred Scott case and provide citizenship and the right to vote to freed slaves. If they come out with that interpretation, and I think there's a lot of support for that, they could say that was the meaning of the 14th Amendment, and we're not going to go further. On the flip side, as you just pointed out, the other side could say, well, there was no illegal immigration problem in 1868, and so there's no way that the amendment could have been designed to stop it. So I think it's really going to come down to a handful of words, right? The reference to jurisdiction in the language of the 14th Amendment. And at this moment, I really couldn't tell you with any kind of confidence that I can estimate how the court is ultimately going to rule.
Yeah, although the betting markets have it at like a 20-1 shot that they overturn or that they uphold President Trump's executive order. But yeah, you're right. I don't know either, and I don't read too much into the questioning from perhaps swing votes like Amy Coney Barrett, because they could be playing devil's advocate. You never exactly know. So it will be interesting, but it has huge implications, and to some extent, as jurists, you have to look at the practical consequences and say, well, it's clear that sort of exigency was either not contemplated or certainly based on the intent was not something that would have been abided by the framers of, well, in this case, say the 14th Amendment or the 1866 Civil Rights Act. And so it'll be interesting to see how some of those who consider themselves originalists come down.
Right. I could also see a few ways you can get sort of a split decision in terms of the ultimate ruling. I could see one way the court could go is to say, we're not going to come down on what the word jurisdiction means. So we're going to leave the status quo, and we're going to look to Congress to tell us what jurisdiction means and whether it means physical jurisdiction, like exactly where the person is born, versus the jurisdiction of the parents if they are citizens of another country.
Yeah, that's interesting, but I mean, that's almost, it's not quite, but it's almost like Congress needs to tell us what a woman is. I mean, the Supreme Court makes decisions all the time on what the word jurisdiction means in the context of, say, whether someone has standing, personal jurisdiction, subject matter jurisdiction, but now they don't know what it means.
Well, we've seen them punt. And that could be sometimes a way they like to save face and say, we're not going to make the tough call.
Yeah.
We're going to leave that to the legislature. Another way you can get a split decision is I could see them making a distinction and really playing on that concept of domicile. and say, well, okay, we see someone that has shown intent to reside here for a while, even if they're illegally here, as someone who has subjected themselves to the jurisdiction of the U.S., as opposed to someone who flies in, the transient, the tourist sort of birth industry. I could see them saying, well, that we're going to say the person has not subjected themselves to the jurisdiction. So that's another way we can kind of get a split vote here that doesn't give us a clear answer one way or the other.
That's interesting. I mean, I wouldn't put it past him either. But I mean, that would be a very Solomonic decision because, okay, so what are the standards by which someone clears the intent threshold? If they're wiring money back to their family in, say, Mexico, does that mean they don't have intent to stay? Does it mean it does? You know, now you have the Supreme Court getting into the legislative realm by having to define what the threshold is to establish intent.
It would be very practically difficult, which is why I hope they don't come up with something that creative. And I hope that they give us a clear answer one way or the other. Either birthright citizenship stands, which is the way it's been interpreted since 1868, or it does not.
Yeah.
And hopefully that they'll give us a clear answer one way or the other.
Yeah. What's your reaction to the sacking of Pam Bondi? Justified?
Well, not totally surprising. I think that she's overall done a really good job in terms of the crime rates, in terms of not being bullied by the Democrats in Washington here. She's tough. She's feisty. She's smart. I think that the Epstein file issue didn't look good. I think her kind of coming out a year ago saying that she was going to look at the file and release it ASAP was never really a practical statement and didn't really make a lot of sense. I think the way that the prosecutions of James Comey and Letitia James have gone probably did not make President Trump happy. So I think, and remember, she never came as a real Washington insider. She wasn't the longtime federal prosecutor or federal judge model like a Mike Mukasey or a Bill Barr, and she wasn't the longtime Washington politician type, right, like a Jeff Sessions or a John Ashcroft. She was AG of Florida, big state, important job, but she did not know the mechanics of the department. So I could also see that worked against her because it is a beast. It is a giant mechanism of lawyers and support staff. And you could easily be consumed by longtime DOJ insiders who are more than happy to wait out a temporary attorney general.
Yeah, I mean, here's the other observation I made earlier. Get your reaction to it. Look, the idea that the left promulgates when they're not in power, that the attorney general is independent of the president and so on and so forth, that's not true. The attorney general reports to an elected president. So by definition, they're not independent. The distinction that the left doesn't make, particularly, as I said, when they're not in power, is but a good attorney general owes the president their independent legal advice. And where I'm going is to say part of the problem I see with Trump's elections and with subsequent performances, not just Bondi, but also Noem, perhaps others, is the complicating factor of having to be subservient, borderline obsequious to the president. And it complicates the job. It makes the job much more difficult than if there was a shared understanding of what the parameters were.
Well, I mean, this is a thankless job. Whether it's Todd Blanche or Lee Zeldin or whoever gets it next, I feel for that person because there's never been an attorney general that's really survived well under President Trump. It's tough because I agree with you. I never liked this concept of this arm's length independent Justice Department because not only does the Attorney General report to the president, all the enforcement powers that the Justice Department bears emanate from the Article 2 powers of the president. Mm-hmm. So it all stems from the occupant of the White House as far as the enforcement of the law. So the idea that the Attorney General is off doing whatever he or she wants and the White House has nothing to do with it never made sense. That was sort of a fiction that was perpetrated by, like you say, whomever was out of power at the time. But you're right. You don't want a Justice Department that's subservient. You want them to be able to give objective advice in terms of prosecutions and interpretations and arguments before the Supreme Court by the Solicitor General. And so I think whoever comes in next is really going to have to thread that needle by saying we understand the priorities that are set by the White House and we respect them and we will carry them out. But at some point we got to draw a line and say we have to make our judgment about what cases actually have evidence that support them and not go out there and make fools of ourselves like having grand juries that reject charges.
Right. I mean, for example, those you mentioned, Comey and Letitia James. Now Letitia James is there's another criminal referral with respect to Letitia James. It'll be interesting to see how Blanche or the next AG handles that. But do you think also with the installation of U.S. attorneys that got sidelined by the courts like Haba in New Jersey, do you think that those were poor risks that Bondi took and she should have told the president something he didn't want to hear, perhaps, but it would have avoided these embarrassments? Well,
they were distractions for an otherwise pretty successful Justice Department in terms of just pure law enforcement. And we had the same issue here in Virginia, where you had a temporary U.S. attorney removed by the judges here. And it turned into months and months of fighting that ultimately the Justice Department lost and they gave up on. So it is a little puzzling when the president insists on his person be appointed, even if that person's not really qualified and is not going to get past Senate confirmation.
Joseph Moreno, former federal prosecutor at the Department of Justice and the National Security Division, a former staff member with the FBI's 9/11 Review Commission, and a U.S. Army combat veteran. Joseph Moreno, thanks as always. Appreciate your insights.
Yeah, and always a pleasure. Have a great weekend.
You too. And Joseph Moreno joined us on Chicago's Morning Answer.
It's like a hot, steaming cup of information to start your day. It's Chicago's Morning Answer on AM 560. The Answer.
As a local business owner, you get called